Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, September 22nd. We're back after a few weeks off and a lot of news for us to talk about. First of all, this week, the UN General Assembly met in New York. Not only was there fireworks with President Zelensky and President Biden accusing Russia of violating the UN Charter, but there were also a whole bunch of people who just didn't show up. Maybe they figured out that too much bad traffic in New York just was enough for their high blood pressure. Then we'll take a look at China, where a cabinet seems to be disappearing as now the defense minister follows the foreign minister in, I don't know, exile, oblivion, or whatever. And then we'll talk about this extraordinary conflict that is emerging between India and Canada, with the Prime Minister of Canada accusing the Indian government of assassinating a Sikh leader on Canadian soil, who happens to also be a Canadian citizen. Here to talk about all of these issues this week are Susan Glasser, staff writer from The New Yorker, Bobby Ghosh, opinion editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and Jamil Anderlini, who is the editor-in-chief of Political Europe. Susan, Bobby, Jamil, great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Susan, let me jump off right with you on UNGA. President Biden was there. He was the only leader of the P5 to show up. President Zelensky was there, and a whole bunch of people weren't there. The Indian Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, the French President, people who would normally want to strut the international stage. And of course, Xi Jinping wasn't there. What was accomplished at UNGA, and what does this absence of leaders really mean for the future of the United Nations?
Well, thank you, Ivo. It's great to be with you. And I'm really looking forward, actually, to learning a lot about, what really is going on in China. So, hopefully we can get right through, because you've just asked a question that has a very simple and short answer. When you said, what has been accomplished at UNGA, the answer, of course, is nothing. And in many ways, each year it becomes more and more an exercise in the, sort of fecklessness and irrelevance of international institutions when you look at the scale and magnitude of the challenges that we face. And in particular, the problem of governance at the UN is a huge one. And I think even more than in Volodymyr Zelensky's speech to the General Assembly, that was really underscored, I thought, in his special appearance before the UN Security Council, which essentially exists in a state of permanent gridlock. As long as Russia and China are permanent members of the UN Security Council, they hold a veto over its actions. And what that means is that even something as egregious as the invasion of one's neighbor in order to reconquer colonial territory, despite you and everyone else in the international community having guaranteed the borders of that neighbor, when the UN Security Council can't even do anything about that, then it ceases to exist as a meaningful body of governance. So then, for years, people have fallen back on this notion, well, at least it's a talk shop. At least it's a place where, at a moment of friction and fissure and polarization, the world can come together and at least talk about those things that mutually concern it. Well, that's where the no-shows this year suggest bigger and bigger challenges. And putting aside Xi Jinping, who at least can come to the United States without fear of arrest, Vladimir Putin, leader of one of the world's other leading nuclear powers, he can no longer leave Russia without fear of arrest, given his status as an indicted, international criminal, and the ongoing nature of the war crimes that Russia is perpetrating inside of Ukraine. And so, I'm pessimistic, as I imagine everyone else on this conversation is, about the future of the United Nations. And then just quickly, a quick, recap of, what was kind of the main event in the absence of any meaningful dialogue across these fissures. both President Biden and President Zelensky, of course, did make Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing conflict there the centerpiece in many ways of their speeches. And I was struck by the purposefulness with which both of them tried to emphasize a message that would reach a broader audience, not just the core allies in Western Europe and the United States and Canada, but to try to make more of an outreach to the global South. In particular, it was notable that President Biden in his speech did not use his personal favorite line about the war between democracies and autocracies. That's one that's been a sore point. Even his staff at times has tried, I think, to excise that from his rhetoric. He did say, again, this is an inflection point. He certainly did say the conflict was important for democracy. But I was struck by the pitch, in particular, where he said, essentially, if we cannot, as a world body, guarantee the independence of Ukraine, then who among you, could really feel secure? Number one, I think that's a really important point, that there are universal principles at issue here, and that turning a blind eye to Russia's aggression here may have consequences in other parts of the world. That's an important pitch. I also heard a lot of rhetoric from President Biden about the inequities in the global economic system, about aid. I thought he made a point that resonated here in Washington with our partisan politics about the effectiveness of a U.S. program like PEPFAR, which is the extraordinarily successful program to combat AIDS in Africa that was launched by former President George W. Bush, a Republican. That message was, clear contrast with today's Republican Party. And, we can talk more about what happened to President Zelensky when he came here to Washington after his UN appearance. But basically, I'll stop there because it was a lot of talking. And if anyone was looking for concrete action, this wasn't the place or the time for that.
Ivo, could I jump in? Do you mind?
Absolutely.
I had two follow-ups to what Susan was saying. One is it's been fascinating this week, even as the Ukrainian president has been speaking at the UN. This is the week that the Western alliance has apparently has begun to blink and begun to really waver, including Poland, which has said just this week that they will no longer send weapons to Ukraine, their own weapons, partly because of Ukrainian grain flooding in, and mainly because there's an election coming in Poland, and they're trying to convince the farmers to keep voting for them, and the farmers are suffering from large Ukrainian grain imports. But it's been absolutely fascinating just in the last few days to hear the countries that have been by far the staunchest supporters of Ukraine and staunchest opponents of Russia starting to supposedly waver. And then I think Susan was alluding there to something my colleagues in Washington have been reporting a fair amount on, which is parts of the Republican establishment refusing to even meet with Zelensky, or definitely, or even in some cases take security briefings around what's happening in Ukraine, which seems worrisome from the point of view of America standing behind Ukraine staunchly as it has until now, and we hope it will continue to. The other thing I was going to just draw out a little bit further to Susan's point about the growing irrelevance of the United Nations. One or two of my colleagues, people that I'm talking to here, have begun to make proposals that, frankly, a few years ago would have been seen as just, fantasy land, but now increasingly seem more and more realistic, which is an alternative to the United Nations, post-1945, post-World War II global architecture, and that is alliances of democracies, trade agreements between free societies, free democracies. The CEO of the parent company of Politico has just published a book called The Trade Trap. Absolutely fascinating. I got to see some earlier drafts on some of the China stuff, and very audacious suggestions. But basically, in a nutshell, what he's saying is free societies that meet a certain threshold of free and open, democratic, should get together and they should lower tariffs to zero and not impose tariffs on any country that does not meet democratic and principles and thresholds of freedom. Again, like I say, 5-10 years ago, people would have been like, yeah, whatever. I'm fascinated by the reception that I've seen here in Europe, which has been like, yeah, interesting idea. Let's talk about it. And I think that is an enormous shift in the way that the world interacts with each other.
Bobby, Jamil, and Susan are both making a lot of great points, and take it any way you want. I see there's the Ukraine issue, the question of where that goes. There's also sort of this global governance question of if people don't show up to meetings anymore, the meetings themselves are becoming really meaningless.
That's a big part of it. It feels like there are too many. There are too many of these now. There are too many parties for these folks to go to. They're just partied out. They were just in, a bunch of them were in South Africa for BRICS. Then a bunch of them were in India for the G20. They've already seen each other. But what else are they going to say to each other at this point? At least those who went to those particular parties. And the absentees, they are really quite surprising. The Russian one, not so much for reasons we've already discussed. Xi Jinping has political crises at home. Rishi Sunak, you might say that, okay, he's got an election next year and he's got a tough bunch of challenges on his plate. But Macron, he decided to skip the UN to hang out with King Charles. I mean, what on earth? I'm hoping
priorities straight.
Clarity on that. But for King Charles, of all people. Modi has political embarrassment that he wants to avoid. Lula turned up. I suppose that's a good thing. But Macron is the one that really surprises me. Jamil, what's going on?
So here's the quote that I read in Politico, in I think Political Europe, which was stunning. That the French believe that the BRICS are more important, and they would have liked to have come and been invited to the BRICS summit rather than the UN General Assembly. That's a remarkable, if true, that's a remarkable reprioritization.
I couldn't pretend to understand the complex mind that is the mind of Monsieur le Président de la République. But what I would say is that he has a sort of stronger streak of anti-Americanism than most Europeans. We've talked a little bit about this on this show previously. I think there's an element of the UN is in New York. It's the Americans dominate it. It's an American institution. I think there is a bit of this feeling that's going around, and there are alternatives popping up, and to your point, Bobby, there are so many of these. When do you get to govern your own country if you're constantly on the road going to, and how do you get reelected? I mean, he can't be reelected. He'd like to be reelected. Yeah. He'd like to change the rules so he could get reelected. But he can't. But he has serious issues at home still. I mean, it was only a couple of months ago we're talking. There were massive riots across all of France. It doesn't help him to turn up at the UN and give a speech that most people in France aren't going to listen to. So I think it's all part of the shift that we're describing, right? There is a huge shift going on.
Yes, there is, but also, I'm skeptical about the idea of an alternative United Nations. I mean, G20, by adding Africa, is sort of widening the membership base, and they may, I can imagine they will feel obliged to include ASEAN and Mercosur and gradually expand it until the point of G20 is completely lost. It will become like the United Nations without any real budget, without a bank, without a peacekeeping force. So basically, even more of a talk shop than the United Nations is. I'm skeptical that that's going to provide a real alternative to the United Nations. But I can see the argument that, okay, there are other platforms through which you can talk. But when it comes to actually addressing world issues, and let's not forget, the climate summit also took place here at the same time. The big issues that need to be addressed, I'm not seeing a real alternative to the United Nations for all its flaws, and God knows there are many.
I think Bobby's point is a very important one, and it's interesting, Jamil. I was at a thing this week with Matthias Döpfner, who is the CEO of Axel Springer, in the book that you mentioned. And interestingly, there was real skepticism on two quarters from the kind of journalists and thought leaders who were at this gathering. One was on the issue of the democracies versus autocracies framing, for exactly the reason that Biden's aides often are wary of including that in speeches, because as much as it appeals to us and it has a sort of neo Franklin Roosevelt sound to it, when you put it in blunt terms about this being a side for choosing, you can be unpleasantly surprised with the results. And I think look at India's response to the war in Ukraine, and you have an example of, to a Washington ear, of course, India should be on the side of democracies because India is the world's largest democracy, and that's not how it's played out. And so one was the skepticism of the idea because it would embrace that even more and be potentially a less inclusive version. And then the second was actually just on the trade front. It's primarily an economic and trade-oriented idea. And again, when you look at what are crucial natural resources in a new age of competition between the United States and Russia and China, sort of a great power competition lens, you look and you see that a lot of the crucial resources and minerals are in places that are very far from being democracies, and yet nonetheless we'll need to trade with them potentially on as advantageous a basis as possible. So those were the two things. And then there's also just this point about once you really unravel the UN, to Bobby's point, right? Everybody is already freelancing new groupings. The expansion of the BRICS, I think, was a very appreciated moment in the last few months, and I think it boded very ill, not only for the future of the UN and the G20 and the like, but just in general, it suggested that this great power moment may not go exactly as we envisioned, with people inevitably lining up with the United States as the tribune of the free world. I was really struck that you have a continuum there, with Brazil and India, and then Iran, in the same grouping. It doesn't look good. I think it doesn't look good.
It's a great segue to Susan. Important points to our next topic. China and the not only the disappearing cabinet, but also the disappearing president and general secretary, because it is quite remarkable for a man who wants to stride the global stage and become sort of competitor, or sees himself at least as a competitor of the president of the United States, to not go to the two biggest international meetings of the year, the G20 and immediately then the UN. So, Jamil, as someone who watches this closely, what's going on? No more foreign minister, no more defense minister, and a president who seems to decide that the problems at home are bigger than the opportunities abroad.
Yeah, and I think that's because the problems at home are much, much bigger than the opportunities abroad. If you just look at what's happening in the economy, the problems that have built up over the last decade and a half are now really, I think, coming to the fore when it comes to the massive debt load that's built up that has mostly been poured into real estate, mostly empty buildings. You can get on a high-speed train, and this has been the case actually for nearly a decade. You can get on a high-speed train in the very, very south of China in Guangzhou, and you can take it to the tippy top of Manchuria. And all along the tracks, as far as you can see, are empty, half-built apartment blocks. And like I said, that's been the case for a long time, and they've just been pouring and pouring and pouring cement. Securing the economy of Australia, for example, because they just keep building stuff. But it's empty apartments built with debt. There are similarities to Japan in the 80s bubble and early 90s. There are some differences, but I would say at this point more similarities than differences. And it's going in a very ugly direction, and there is a lot of resentment and building up concern amongst ordinary citizens, amongst the elite. For a long time, there's been real concern and resistance amongst the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, who have been silenced by being arrested or losing their jobs or, just being cowed. One of the most worrying things, in my opinion, is you have these shadow banks, shadow financial systems that are collapsing. Ordinary citizens going to ask for their money back, not being given their money, no explanation. They go to protest, they're all arrested. That is a spiraling crisis. Again, it's been going on for a long time. There's been a low grade. That sort of thing's been happening. I've covered those protests myself 10 years ago and personally in Beijing and Shanghai and other places. But I think the dire state of the economy is applying really intense pressure on Xi Jinping, combined with the dire state of relations between primarily China and the United States, but China and many other countries. And then you have these hand-picked top officials, minister level, cabinet level officials who Xi Jinping personally put in their jobs, is personally very, very closely associated with and connected to, and they've started to disappear. And that is, I think, a concerning sign for any authoritarian system, and a warning sign to the rest of the world that all is not well in Zhongnanhai in Beijing. We talked about this on a previous show. The foreign minister was a personal friend of mine. I keep his business card from 15 years ago on my desk with his mobile. You can't see the whole number. I'll block it out, with his mobile number written on it, which was still his mobile number. That was when he was my minder in the foreign ministry, and I've kept in touch with him. We kept in good contact. I saw him as recently as April, and a month or two later he was gone. And
does he answer his mobile phone now, Jamil?
No, he doesn't, Ivo. But I mean, very sadly, in all seriousness, and very sadly, the rumors that are coming out of Beijing is that he has already passed away for whatever reason. Now it's the defense minister. The defense minister's gone. Presumably, the rumors coming out, it's a corruption investigation. But the foreign minister disappeared around the same time as the head of the nuclear weapons program and the deputy head of the nuclear weapons program, the rocket forces in the Chinese People's Liberation Army. These things look to be related. One day, I suspect we'll discover they all were somewhat related. Now, an interesting perspective on this that I heard from a very senior Western intelligence official, they pointed out that, yeah, it's a sign of destabilization, but to be completely blunt about it, these are interchangeable figureheads. The foreign minister doesn't make foreign policy in China. He, at best, turns up to meetings and implements what the emperor and the emperor's closer advisors are deciding. Same with the defense minister in China. He is the person who goes to the international meetings. He actually has no combat responsibilities or any sort of operational responsibilities when it comes to the People's Liberation Army, even on doctrine. And the one who's just disappeared, Li Shangfu, he actually came out of the logistics department, which of course is by far the most corrupt part of the whole thing. I remember, the last thing I'll say on this whole thing, I remember, again, about a decade or so ago in Beijing, a defense attaché from a major Western country saying to me that they'd done their analysis, and this was a very well-connected defense attaché, and he said to me, their estimate was somewhere between 60 and 70% of the Chinese military budget was being stolen. And that was at that point. I think it has gotten better because Xi Jinping has arrested and murdered hundreds of generals in the last decade or so. But it's still pretty bad, probably, and maybe not Russia levels, but still pretty bad.
Waste, fraud, and abuse in the Chinese MOD. Who could have thought on that? Thanks, Jamil. Bobby, how do you read this? I mean, it's not a sign of a stable system when people just appointed by the emperor, the new guy who is president for life and had just been named for a third term. They're all disappearing. Something is wrong with the vetting process, to say the least.
Well, yes, and Jamil sort of raised a point which I thought was very interesting, which is the comparison to Japan when in the 80s and 90s, and of course that's the big difference. Well, there's several, but that is a really big difference. The Japanese collapse took place in slow motion and to great extent in sort of in the cold light of day. We could see it happen. We knew why it was happening. We could rely upon, for the most part, on the data. The political actors were well known and their behavior was predictable, all of which helped the global economy, even though, the second largest economy of the world was slowing and occasionally teetering. We could all plan for it because we knew what was there. With China, we just don't. There's just the absence of transparency and the disappearances of these powerful figures, or at least prominent figures, sort of underlines the absence of transparency. The Chinese citizens themselves have no real window into what is going on, never mind the rest of us. This makes for greater economic uncertainty for all of us. And that's the big, sort of the big difference between what's going on in China now and Japan in the 80s. It's how does the rest of the world, given how much larger China is in the sort of global economic scheme of things than even Japan was, how do we legislate for that? How do we plan our economies for that? I think it's a serious problem. And then, of course, you always worry. This is slightly out there, but not very far. You always worry that about essentially a dictator who faces this much political turbulence and sort of citizen dissatisfaction among the citizen. What might he do in order to distract attention from all those things? And there's a whole gamut of things that he might do, none of which are reassuring to anybody, to China's neighbors or to the rest of us. And so the absence of clarity, the risk of black swan events, if you like, is so great. And that's what should keep, and probably does keep, sort of many world leaders up late into the night.
Susan, among those world leaders, no doubt, Joe Biden, who has to deal with China in one form or another, politically being pressed to be as tough as he can, but also a responsibility for maintaining some sense of order and not have anything escalate. How when you walk around town in Washington, how are they looking at these events, both the disappearance of these major leaders, but also the absence of Xi in New York and Delhi, and hopefully he will show up in San Francisco. I guess they're spending a lot of time trying to convince him to do that for a bilateral meeting with Biden. But what do you hear in Washington?
Yeah, I think you're right that there is a level of concern, as much as the politics have turned quite hawkish in both parties in many ways over the last few years. That's been a big, almost, secular shift in thinking in both Democratic and Republican circles. But what you have seen the last few months is a pretty concerted effort, I think, by the Biden administration to dial things down a bit. You've seen a number of visits after they had essentially ceased between the two capitals. You've seen, not only the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary, once again, the National Security Advisor has had 2 rounds of secret talks with his counterpart, both in Vienna and then most recently in Malta. So, dialogue is happening at a level that it hadn't been happening at, which I find notable given these events inside China. Partially, I think, like everyone, they're trying to understand, to pat the elephant and figure out what is it really made of right now. I found Jamil's sort of observations fascinating about what this might mean. I also think the context here, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what she is gleaning from it. And it seems quite reasonable to think that one of the things is that he's looking at, first of all, the destabilizing impact that the invasion not going as well as expected has had on Putin himself and his standing, and the Prigozhin mutiny, I'm sure, was not lost on those in Beijing. What do dictators care most about? They care most about remaining in power. And so partially, I wonder if that is one explanation for shoring up his base, or feeling that insecure in some way we don't fully understand. And then there's the corruption issue. And, what is one explanation for Russia's failure to perform as an army of that size and resource level ought to perform? Remember that Russia is a far vaster country with far larger resources, with a far bigger military capability on paper that absolutely should have overwhelmed Ukraine in a few days, as the U.S. military and intelligence analysts expected. Well, why didn't it? One of the reasons is the extraordinary heroism and will to fight, of course, of the Ukrainian people in an existential fight to keep their country and their land. And another is almost certainly the massive corruption that has riddled the Russian military, not just for the last few years, but for, decades going back many, many years. And so you got to wonder if Xi, who is trying to prepare China to play a much more muscular role in the world and to possibly project force outside of its own borders in a way that it has not done so since that not very successful 1979 war against Vietnam, whether she takes the lesson from Russia, you better get your act in order right now. And, all those billions that you spent haven't necessarily gone into increasing military capabilities.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Susan, and it sort of underscores the difficulty of reading the situation. On the one hand, you think that leaders in trouble at home look for adventurism abroad, and on the other hand, the adventurism abroad creates new risks and uncertainties, and may lead to better preparation for that possibility. And that's why we're all trying to read tea leaves here without necessarily knowing where it's going. Great discussion. But let me Bobby, switch to our last topic where we don't have to read tea leaves, because the Prime Minister of Canada went in front of his Parliament to accuse another government, India in this case, of assassinating a Sikh leader on Canadian soil who himself was a Canadian citizen. And it spiraled down ever since. How, first of all, what happened? And secondly, why did Trudeau feel that he had to go public on this? And third, how are the Indians and the Canadians going to try to get out of this thing?
Yeah, those are all very complex and difficult questions. Here's the backdrop. There is a Sikh community in Canada. A small minority of that Sikh community supports the cause of what is called Khalistan, the idea of an independent Sikh state carved out of the Indian state of Punjab. This is a long-running campaign in the 80s, and when I grew up in India, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s, this was a very violent campaign. They were Sikh, the pro-Khalistan groups that were fomenting violence, carrying out acts of violence, and frankly, acts of terrorism within India. Since then, it culminated, for those who are old enough to remember, in the assassination of Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguards. Since then, that movement has sort of gone into hibernation. Within India, there's very little traction for the idea of Khalistan. In large Sikh communities outside of India, in Britain, in Canada, there are small pockets of people who still cling on to that hope. India regards all these people still as terrorists. One of the people that India categorized in that way was Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Canadian citizen, lived in a town called Surrey, south of Vancouver, very close to the border with Washington State. On the 18th of June, 2 masked gunmen shot him dead. This much is uncontrovertible. The Canadians apparently picked up evidence to suggest that Indian intelligence agencies or the Indian government ordered the hit or in some way participated or cooperated in the hit. They brought up agency to agency, the traditional way to discuss these things. They brought it up with the Canadian investigation, brought it up with their Indian counterparts. They got nowhere. The matter escalated. The Canadians and Trudeau asked for support from the Five Eyes, got nothing from there. He tried to get Rishi Sunak of Britain and Joe Biden of the US to intervene to try and get some response out of India. He was advised, apparently, not to rake this up before the G20 summit in Delhi. Essentially, he was told, let Modi have his party and don't be the party pooper. Well, he didn't. He went to Delhi and then tried to bring this up quietly with Modi on a one-to-one basis. Again, he was rebuffed. And then finally, and this is clearly as a last resort, he brought this up in Parliament. Now that he has done so, this is out in the open. This is in the court of public opinion. The Indian response has been flat out to deny, to say this is rubbish, this is rubbish, this is rubbish, this is absurd. Modi hasn't said anything about it himself. And it now presents everybody with a conundrum. Trudeau is going to have to put some of this evidence into the public domain so he can sort of reinforce his claim and get some sense of, persuade everybody else that this is not just some wild speculation. If he produces some evidence, then the Indians will be forced to respond. Caught in the middle of this is Joe Biden, who has made, who has to deal with America's closest ally, literally and perhaps figuratively as well, right next door, and this giant country that he wants to make an ally. He has embraced Modi fully, and you lie down with dogs and you wake up with fleas, as the saying goes, as Ben Franklin said. By embracing Modi, he's embraced everything that comes with Modi. That includes sort of democratic sort of retreat within India, the repression of minorities, particularly of Muslims, the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. That's all in India. That's hard enough for Biden to wrap his policy around. Now, if it turns out to be true, big if, that India conducted a hit in a foreign country within sort of earshot practically of the American border, that gives Biden a huge problem. I mean, the Indians, just to make matters worse, have invited Biden to go to India next February to be the chief guest of the Republic Day parade, the Republic Day ceremonies. I'll be very interested to see whether Biden says yes to that. And if he does, he's going to have to explain why he's propping up this, frankly, illiberal leader in that, who's, again, big if, who's flexing his muscles in a way that completely sort of undermines the rule of law, the whole idea of a rules-based order. That, by the way, since we started this conversation about the United Nations, India for the longest time has been arguing that it should be part of the Security Council. It's a little hard to make that argument when you're disregarding the rules of the United Nations and the global order so flagrantly.
Or not showing up at his meetings in one form.
That may be an explanation. Perhaps he didn't want to see Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. Susan developed the point that Bobby brought up in terms of Biden. The administration had a hard time trying to figure out how to talk about human rights issues when Biden was in India, of course, and there's little doubt that if the Canadians believe that this has really happened, we will have all the evidence the Canadians have, and it's going to be hard for us to say it didn't. And the statements that have come out from Washington since the Trudeau statement have been supportive of at least the allegations. But a really tough pickle that Biden finds himself in. How does he get out?
Yeah, the timing is not good, given that this state visit just occurred, followed by the G20 party in India itself, and I think that it actually hits at a nerve that is an underappreciated kind of sore spot for the Biden administration on foreign policy. I was just thinking, like, I think it's one of the things that I got the most wrong, and I think others did as well, which is that we believed Biden in the 2020 campaign when he said that human rights was going to be much more of a pillar of his foreign policy and a way to navigate in a complicated world. It seemed in keeping with his history. It also seemed like the kind of juxtaposition that he would want to make from his predecessor, Donald Trump, and Trump's, kind of extraordinary for an American president penchant of sucking up to the world's dictators and bad guys. And yet, despite the stirring rhetoric, if you strip that away, one of the things that's most notable, I think, is the realist strand to Biden's foreign policy. And in fact, India is one example, but it's only one example. I'm thinking right now as well of the mega Mideast deal that the United States is in the middle of negotiating between two of the Middle East's most illiberal leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu, and we didn't talk about that, but Biden's so uncomfortable with Israel's leader that he held him off from a one-on-one meeting for longer than any Israeli president and Israeli prime minister and American president have met. I think going back to the 1960s, and yet we're in this talks between not only Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize their relations, but to do all sorts of other things, including potentially provide a U.S. security guarantee to Saudi Arabia. I think that's going to make many American liberals and supporters of the Biden administration deeply uncomfortable. And you could see the effort beginning already to launder the reputation of the Saudi Crown Prince MBS. He was giving interviews to Western outlets during UNGA this week. There's a sense that if this is going to happen, it's in some ways a continuation, actually, of Donald Trump's Mideast policy, and it would represent the fulfillment of one of the things that young Jared Kushner, now funded to the tune of billions of dollars by the Saudi Crown Prince, that's exactly what he was trying to accomplish and didn't get to at the end of the Trump administration. So that's another example that's in keeping with this India example. And I've heard, as I'm sure you have, Ivo, that the pushback that you get from the Biden White House, which is, listen, if you want me to essentially be in a proxy war with Russia over Ukraine, and you want to shore up Ukraine at this moment in time, if you want to focus on countering the Chinese, then you have to take your partners where you can get them. You can't use this kind of exclusive rhetoric. You can't focus on important but lesser issues, which is clearly the category that they put human rights in.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's certainly the case. Jamil, last word to you on this India Canada fracas, which is also touching the Europeans in a very important. Canada's a NATO member, a very important a G7 member, a very important partner of the European Union, of key European countries, and yet India is also seen as the next manufacturing hub for the world, as Europeans and others are trying to de-risk from the Chinese economy. A real pickle for them too, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things here, and I'll go quickly. One thing is that Apple is moving iPhone production into India from China. That's part of its diversification strategy. That is seen as like the better alternative to China to de-risk. Is partly it's about pulling your supply chains out and not being so reliant on China. It gets more complicated when you're dealing with a very liberal government in India, and increasingly liberal, and a government now that perhaps is willing to go and do extrajudicial executions. I was on the campaign trail last time India had an election. India has an election next year. I found it absolutely fascinating, absolutely, mind blowing. I went to all corners of the country with various politicians, and it really is an incredible feat. It's coming next year. Modi is almost certain to win that. He's wildly popular still amongst the majority of people in the country. And if you listen to his defenders, they say, listen, like Congress Party, other parties, they had decades to build the roads and to build the infrastructure, and nobody did it, and Modi's done it. And all the stuff around murdering journalists and treating Muslims very badly. That's the provinces, and that's not the government in Delhi. So that's the sort of one of the defenses you hear. I would just end by saying it's we're in this extraordinary period where extrajudicial killings outside of countries, assassinations, is a common thing. Actually, you see it in the Tiergarten in Berlin, where a KGB, Russian FSB agent just shoots a dissident in the head in broad daylight in the middle of the garden in the middle of Berlin. That's just one example. We see it all over Europe. Frankly, it's sort of a playground for assassination, and has been, maybe for forever. You see it in London. You see it all through Southeast Asia. There are targeted killings, there are assassinations, there are extraordinary renditions. China is much more, has been much more aggressive on this front, and it's a trend that we see all over the world. And it's to end on a pessimistic note, it's, I think, a sign of our times, and a sign of this fracturing, and a sign of what we started with in this conversation, which is the sort of the breaking down of the post-war American-dominated world order. And it's just another symptom, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where the end comes back to the beginning on where are the rules and who is maintaining order. And this is just one more manifestation of exactly the problem that we started off with. But it just shows you what a tremendous ability the three of you have to bring an entire conversation across such wide ranges of topics back to its essence. Really thankful to Bobby Ghosh, Jamil Anderlini, and Susan Glasser for joining us this week. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend, and thanks all for joining. Bye-bye.